let's discuss converting our ER diagram into a relational model. Our entities become tables. Our attributes become columns. So that part we get. A little bit of tips. We don't create columns for the when you're doing it, don't create columns for your multi-valued attributes. We'll talk about it soon. We'll talk about what we do with those. The composite attributes, you create columns only for the component attributes, not the composite itself. So for example, if you have name and first name and last name, you'll just do the first name, last name. Do not create columns for derived attributes. It can get computed when it's needed. So what does that mean? The derived attributes, for example, let's say you had age and let's say you had date of birth. Date of birth, of course, that's your column and you should keep it in there. But age is a derived attribute, and whenever you need it, you can just generate it. How do you calculate it? It's the difference between the current date and the date of birth. So derived attributes are something when you need them, you can calculate them, but they're not something you would be creating and storing in your database. So how does this look? I took our student entity. As you can see, we have ID, name, and grade. And then and here you'll see ID will become an int, name will become a varchar, grade will become a decimal. So this is how it's going to look. You're going to take your entity, you'll make a table, you'll take your attributes, and you'll make them as columns. What do we do with these weak entities? So a weak entity also gets converted into a table just like a regular entity, but there's one difference. Remember when we spoke about partial keys and that they have to get the primary key of their parent entity to join it to become a primary key. So that's the only thing you need to do. When you have a weak entity, it becomes a table, but then remember what the primary key is of the parent table and add that field into that attribute into your new table so that you can make a composite primary key. So it could be part of your primary key. What do we do with these relationships? So I know we said sometimes they can become tables. So actually often they become tables. I'll give you some general rules. One thing they're sometimes called is a cross-reference table, but you can refer to it as a table. They're going to be tables. But when you know what to do, I'll give you some examples. Many to many. So the first type of relationship we had discussed is a many to many relationship. In this case, if you have a many to many, you need to create a table. This is going to be a third table. And this is the cross-reference table. It's for the relationship. So what's my example? Student, oh man, I spelled enrolls wrong. All right, but student enrolls in course. Pretend I spelled it right. So a student enrolls in course, and enrolled can become a table with the primary key from both. So the student table, let's say, has social security number as the primary key, and course table, let's say, has a CRN number as the primary key. So now you have this enrolled table, and it has social security number and the CRN, so it takes the primary key from both of those tables. And since students can have multiple, and you have to put it in this other table, not only because there's other attributes like grade and credits, which of course, if anything had additional attributes, then you need a table. But the other reason it will need to be here is because a student can enroll in many courses, so you can't keep track of that in a student table. And the same as the course table. Courses have many students, so it's a many to many. You have to have another table that keeps track of, like, oh, here, this student is enrolled in this CRN, and then there's another row with the student is enrolled in this CRN. And that's why it's a composite primary key, because the student can be enrolled in multiple courses, so it's not unique alone. Good? Good. One-to-many. So let's talk one-to-many. There's two options for one-to-many. We can create this cross-reference table, this other table like we spoke about. We can also take the primary key from the one side where it's one-to-many, and we can put it into the table on the many side. And I'm going to give you examples. We have one-to-many faculty teach courses. So we have this a one-to-many example, assuming that one faculty member teaches courses. So a course can be taught by one faculty member. And here, what can we do? We can create a teaches table. So that's the cross-reference table, which will have the CRN and the social security number. Here, because in this case it's one-to-many and the faculty, we don't need a composite primary key. The CRN number alone is unique. And then we have that relationship, and that's fine. But we have another alternative. Because it's one-to-many, we can just add the primary key from the faculty table, which was the social security number. We can add it into the course table. Here we're calling it instructor social security number, but that's fine. And you can call it social security number, doesn't matter, but you can call it instructor social security number to make it clearer. And that would be, of course, a foreign key that references the faculty social security number. And now, because it's a one-to-many in the CRN table, which is the many, you would need to add the instructor social security number, because that would reference the one. There's only one teacher, so it's totally fine to do it this way because there's only one faculty. So how do we know which way to do it? I just said you can create a table, a new table, you can just move it, and use your judgment and think about which way you prefer. It's fine to use either. If you think there's a chance, like maybe later we'll say, hey, 2 faculty members could teach the same course, then maybe you'll say, all right, let's do a table, because we want to keep that in mind. Or if you think there's a chance, or if there's the relationship will have attributes, like the teaches one, what if we want to keep track of specific things, a date or something that's unique to this, or something that's unique to the teaches relationship, grade, let's say grade. So then, of course, in that case, then it would have to be a table. So keep in mind, just think about it, but both ways could really work. So continuing on in the one-to-many, you have the entity on the one side, you have the entity on the many side, and if you wanted to do it like we said, where you can take the primary key from the one side and you could make it a foreign key. So here in this example, let's say I'm giving you another example. Staff registers client. Staff has a primary key of staff number. Client could get staff number added in, just like we did it in with the instructor social security number. We can put staff number into the client table. This works because it's a one-to-many, that a staff has many clients, but a client can only have one staff. Because of that, and in the client table, you could just put a link to the staff number. And that only works because it's one-to-many. If it was many-to-many, this wouldn't work. So now we're on one-to-one. We did many-to-many. We did one-to-many. And now we're going to do one-to-one. So one-to-one, we can also have 2 options. Create a new table. Actually, we have 3 options, but I'll do the first 2 more common ones. We can create a new table, or we can include the primary key of one entity into the other. So which is very similar to our other cases. So let's, in general, usually, you would do number 2. In a one-to-one, you can do number 2. So you could take the primary key from one table and put it as a foreign key in the other. In theory, you can use either side. It's one-to-one. It's not one-to-many. But usually you use your common sense and even a little more than common sense. But let's give you an example. Employee manages a factory. Since most employees don't manage factory, let's say you say an employee manages factory. Some employees, but not every employee manages a factory, but some of them do. Well, since some of them do, but not all of them do, it makes more sense for the employee to be in the factory table, because every factory has a manager. So it makes more sense to put it there since every factory has a manager. And actually, if you look at the total participation, that could give you a hint where it should go. If you see a total participation by the factory, that the factory must have a manager, well then it makes sense to put it there. If you put it in the wrong table, I would say, or the other table, technically it will work under employee, you put factory, but not every employee is managing it, so it's going to be null, 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 null until you get to an employee who manages a factory, who's a manager. So you'll have a lot of nulls. It will work, but it won't be as good. So that's why you can do it, but think about which way makes the most sense. Some of it might help based on the total participation. It may help you decide which way to put it. So which way makes the most sense to be the primary key, and which way makes the most sense to be the foreign key. There is a third option, not as common, but does happen and not crazy. You can merge both tables into one table. Particularly, let's say you had a case of total participation on one side, that every single employee has to manage a factory, and every factory has to manage an employee. Then in theory, and maybe this is not a great case, but especially, but if you think about a different case where it's one-to-one, everyone has to be one-to-one. You could just merge these together, and that's totally fine. Then you can have one table because if that happens, the total participation on both, it would work because there's no reason it wouldn't work. Now, you don't have to do that option, but these are options. And so some of this is going to be left to your own judgment as you're looking at your own ER diagram. N array. So we spoke about ternary and even more. So let's say you had a ternary relationship. What do you do? So here you have no choice. You don't get all these choices. You have to make another table. The relationship's going to become a table. It's going to get the primary key from each of those three in there. And here's my example. Let's say student majors and faculty advisors were all connected in a ternary relationship. Then you would have to put every single primary key in there. The student social security number, the advisor social security number, the major. You'd have to put everything in there together. So that's something to keep in mind. If you have a ternary, then your relationship automatically becomes a table, and you have to put the primary key from each of those three in there, or more if you have more than three entities. Weak entity. So what do we do with the relationship? We said when we have a weak entity, it connects with a relationship with a strong entity. So what happens to this relationship? In this case, it doesn't, if you recall from the beginning of this lecture, I mentioned that because of the partial attribute primary key, we had to move over the primary key from the parent table, from the strong table into there. So it had to have the primary key. We had to copy it. So because the primary key is already there, we already have this link. So you don't have to do anything at this point. We're already done. So if you think about it, it's usually one-to-many or one-to-one because it has to connect to that strong entity. And so we already, because it had to connect, we already put the primary key from the other table into there. So we should be set. So here we should be good. Now, lastly, I promised you we would talk about multi-valued attributes. You can make a table with two columns, and then you have one for the primary key of the owning table and one for the value itself. So basically, what does that mean? If you have a column like phone that's multi-valued, where an employee can have multiple phone numbers, so what would you do? You can't put it all in the same column. So the best way to do this is you make another table, and the other table, it keeps track of the phone number and the social security number. So it would take the primary key of the original table, the social security number from the employee table, and it would also take the phone number and of that attribute, and it would put this into this new table. And so if you think about it now, let's say this employee has one phone number, then there could be another row. This employee has another one, and they can have multiple phone numbers, and that's totally fine. And then so it's just, as you can see, it's not going to be an attribute in the employee table. It's just going to be an attribute in the employee phone table now, and this way we can have as many phone numbers as somebody wants to list. It's totally fine in different rows. Of course, we can join it to get these values. So that's what you do. You make the table, which will have the two columns, one for the primary key of the other table, of the original, and one for the values themselves.